philosophy has always been a process of learning how to live our life in the best way possible. And, this is a class on Buddhist philosophy, but that's just as true in the Greek philosophical tradition as well, where, according to Aristotle, the purpose of philosophy was eudaimonia, happiness, but not in the conventional sense, but in the sense of living a fulfilled life. And in Aristotle's view, pleasure and comfort and material gain was insufficient for happiness. That, in fact, a life spent pursuing material comfort and material gain was a wasted life, because you couldn't really achieve eudaimonia that way. You couldn't really achieve happiness that way. And in his point of view, being in service to your society, being in service to community is one of the highest vocations. And the only way to do that skillfully is to think and live philosophically. The purpose of philosophy, according to Aristotle, was to develop virtue. And virtue wasn't a set of rules or guidelines, but it was something that you had to be able to apply moment to moment using good judgment, neither acting too stingily or not sufficiently, nor acting too boldly or too bravely. He said his view was that it was a balance, and that we were always in this process of finding that balance, and that you really only knew if you had lived well in the dying process when you could look back on your life at the moment of death and feel that your life had been lived in a satisfactory way. The reason I bring up Aristotle now is that one of the things that I think that is interesting about Aristotle is he said that his view was that the highest vocation was political science, and that the most important role in society was that of the politician. And the reason was because the politicians were the ones who established virtue for the society that they were responsible for. And one of the important things that politicians did was they helped decide the degree to which and the type of education that the society would offer their young people and their young adults. So from his point of view, the politician was the most important person in society because they determined how young people were going to be educated, and it was the education of the youth that determined the future of your civilization. And so he said that the only way that could happen in a way that was good for society is if the politicians were all well educated in philosophy for the purpose of developing virtue and character, the ability to make the right decision under challenging circumstances. So philosophy is really how we become educated citizens. It's not just a question of logic and rationality and analysis of ethics. It's really about how do we live well, and how do we live well means how do we engage with our society in ways that are beneficial for others. And in Buddhist philosophy, of course, the core problem is suffering. And not just suffering, but samsara. The idea that suffering is a pervasive aspect of the unawakened life for all beings, humans, but also up to and including gods, that even gods experience suffering. Gods are beings that live their life in such a way that they basically can be perpetually hedonistic. Gods have no conventional problems in the sense that humans and animals have problems. Gods are living a life where they never really have to set their feet on the ground, and they never really have to be sullied by eating impure food or having body odor or anything like that. Gods have these beautiful bodies and everything that they always have whatever they want at a whim. But one of the main sufferings of God's life is that other beings are jealous of them, and gods are having to constantly defend what they have. And even when they successfully ward off an invasion of the other jealous lesser gods, who have almost as much as the gods do, but are jealous of the gods that have a little bit more than they do, when the gods successfully rebuff the invasion, their satisfaction is short-lived, because the lesser gods rebuild their forces and then attack the gods anew. So even though the gods have everything that they could possibly want, they're constantly having to defend it from others who would try to take it away from them. And generally the gods always win, but nevertheless they're constantly having to struggle to protect what they have. And I think that we can use that as a metaphor, because we can see people in the world today who are living lives that are similar to the way that the gods are described in myth, where they have everything that they could possibly want, but it's at the expense of having to defend it from sharing it with others. So the nature of samsara is that it continues, even for the most privileged people in society, even for the most privileged beings in the cosmos. Suffering is prevalent, and that it's what drives us through our life, but it's also what drives us into our future lives. And the nature of samsara is that it's produced by our own errors and judgment. That suffering is not something that's imposed upon us by forces outside of us, but that the things that seem to be being imposed upon us from the outside are actually the results of previous causes. And those previous causes were put into place by our own poor judgment, our own selfishness, our own competitiveness, our own rudeness, our own misdeeds of action and speech, but also caused by our own habits of thinking negatively about the world. And, we see a lot of strife in the world that we're in today, a lot of divisiveness, violence, injustice, economic injustice, racial injustice. We see people marginalized, disempowered. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of that because we have so much access to information. We can see so much of what's going on in the world today that it's easy to feel like we're being inundated by all of the suffering in the world. But according to this model of samsara, suffering is pervasive. It's not a unique characteristic of the modern world. It's not something that is due to industrialization or technologization or imperialism. Although those are causes of suffering, those are aspects of suffering. But suffering was just as much a problem 2,500 years ago when Siddhartha Gautama made his discovery of awakening. He just as much talked about the problems of distraction, of the allure of trying to get involved in problems that we try to solve, and in getting involved in those problems, we just end up making the problems worse. He said that it was just as much a problem then as it is now that we are captivated by materialism, money and commerce, acquisitiveness, trying to protect ourselves with material comforts, trying to distract ourselves with entertainment. Those things were just as much a problem in antiquity as they are today. And it's not because it's not just a characteristic of our world, but you see it's a characteristic of samsara. It's a characteristic of the habits of the mind to try to solve our problems through distraction, or to identify things that are problems and going out and trying to solve them, getting into fights with people to try to convince them that we're right. And so in Buddhism, there's two main ways to address samsara. One of those is one that we're familiar with, which is acting in the world to help others, doing what we can to try to alleviate the suffering of other people, looking to ways that we can contribute to our community, ways that we can contribute to our society to try to make the world a better place, working to end injustice, working to improve equality and equity. But equally important, and maybe more important, is working internally to uproot the causes of suffering, the causes of samsara in our own consciousness. Because in Buddhism teaches that we'll never be able to end suffering in the outer world unless we've been able to end suffering in our own mind stream. And so the purpose of acting in the outer world, the purpose of working to help others, is really to change our karma, to change the flow of our consciousness, the flow of causation, to move the stream, to redirect the flow of karma, to redirect the flow of the river into closer to or more in the direction of peace and equality and freedom from suffering, true happiness. So we do act in the outer world. There's a lot of talk in the Buddhist world today about Buddhist activism, and that and criticism of Buddhists that we just sit around on our cushions and don't actually do anything, and that we are trying to become perfectly still and just kind of detach and tune out the suffering of the outer world, and we can find our little kind of happy place and just sort of stay in our little happy place, and that Buddhists aren't active enough in the world. And interestingly, that's not a new criticism of Buddhism. It's a big topic in Buddhism right now, but it's not a new criticism of Buddhism. Many of Buddha's followers in his lifetime and shortly after his death were dropouts, social dropouts, who got rid of all of their possessions, only had the clothes on their back and a begging bowl, didn't ever touch money, traveled around going door to door begging for leftover food, basically eating other people's garbage, because of course in those days there wasn't refrigeration, so yesterday's food was either going to go to the livestock or the dogs or the Buddhist beggars going door to door asking for food. And there was a response to that Buddhists needed to be more active in the world, to be more engaged in the world. And that criticism, it persists today. But it's important that when we're working to alleviate suffering in the world through activism or social engagement, that's on parity with our own ability to maintain a state of equanimity and mental equipoise and calm. There's kind of an attitude in modern social justice activism circles that if you're not angry, you're not paying attention, and that our activism should be motivated by this, that we're incensed about injustice. But in order to be effective Buddhist activists, we actually need to engage because we're philosophically motivated by wanting equity and ending suffering, alleviating suffering for others. And that's what makes us effective as activists, that we're coming from a place of peace and equipoise, that we're not contributing to the anger in the world, contributing to the divisiveness, not engaging in the fighting, but rather working in ways that are constructive and positive. And this is bodhicitta. This is, it's customary at the beginning of a Buddhist class or a Buddhist practice to set our motivation. And that motivation is bodhicitta, working for the benefit of others, ending suffering for ourselves, but also ending suffering for others. And so this Buddhist activism, if it's coming from this place of genuine caring and mental calm, that's this embodiment of bodhicitta, this engaging with the world, wanting to help others, but underpinned by this understanding of karma, that what we're doing is planting the seeds that are going to ripen in the future as a more peaceful, more just, more equitable world. And that with our actions, it's wonderful if we see positive results of our actions in the present day, but we also can't be attached to that, because we get frustrated if we work hard and don't see the results that we want to see. And we need to realize that what we're doing is affecting the outer world, but even more importantly, we are affecting our mind. We're affecting our worldview. So that's bodhicitta, that desire, that aim, that intention to develop compassion in a radical, powerful, active, potent, engaged kind of way. And that's how we become a bodhisattva, the path of Mahayana Buddhism. It's also customary at the beginning of the class to go for refuge. And we go for refuge in Buddhism to the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. We go for refuge to Buddha by recalling that enlightenment is possible, that Gautama Buddha's great discovery was that suffering could be ended, and that what he called nirvana, the great cessation, the cessation of mental affliction, the cessation of pain and suffering, or perhaps not the cessation of pain, but the cessation of suffering. That's an interesting conversation. The cessation of suffering is possible, and that it's worth striving for. And we go for refuge, we take shelter, we get solace in the idea that this is possible, that it's a worthy goal, and that this historical person, Gautama Buddha, set the stage for us. We go for refuge to the Dharma, the second of the three jewels. The Dharma are the teachings, the methodology. I find this helpful because I recall that wherever I am, there's something that I can do. It's not like Gautama Buddha was an outlier and he was the only one ever, but that he taught many different instructions, and many people in the subsequent centuries have replicated his results, and that there's a path, there's a technique, there's something we can do. It's not just like lightning striking and it's a 1 in a million chance. It's that wherever we're at, we can apply the techniques. We can learn the methodology, and we have tools that we can use. We have a toolbox. So going for refuge to the Dharma is like remembering that we have a toolbox, and whenever we encounter a problem, we have a tool in our Dharma toolbox. And then the third is the Sangha. And going for refuge to the Sangha is remembering that like I mentioned, that the Buddha's results are replicable, and that many people over the centuries, including people alive today, have realized the same discovery that Buddha has. They've put the experiments into practice, and they have made the same kinds of transformations in their consciousness. And also the Sangha is that we have a lot of support in our lives. We have our Dharma community, we have Dharma centers, we have Dharma friends, we have people that we can turn to and ask for help. We have people who are supporting us. And so taking refuge in the Sangha is also this notion that we have a lot of support, that we're not alone in the process, and that we're not kind of blazing a trail, that we have the Buddha's kind of exemplary message, we have the toolbox, the techniques that we can use, and also we have a community of friends who are working with us to help us along the path. So this is our third session on the Heart Sutra. The Heart Sutra is a very short Buddhist text. One of the things that makes it interesting is that it's so pithy, it's so condensed. But one of the issues with that is that because it's so condensed, there's a lot of information that's sort of left out of the text. There's not a lot of exegesis within the text where it explains itself in great detail. It mentions a lot of concepts and a lot of topics almost in passing. So it's worth taking time to go into the text because there's so much useful information that we can get by reading between the lines and by unpacking a lot of this technical terminology. It's in the genre of prajnaparamita, and this is a Sanskrit word. It's the title of the text, Prajnaparamita Hridaya Sutram. And Prajnaparamita means the perfection of wisdom, transcendent wisdom. We have conceptual wisdom, which is where we're studying philosophy, we're working with ideas, we're trying to understand the world more deeply, trying to understand ourselves more deeply. We're working with concepts, with language, we're reading texts, we're discussing, we're working on kind of opening our mind, expanding our perspective, broadening our perspective. But the purpose of conceptual wisdom is to get to non-conceptual wisdom. And that's what Prajnaparamita is really saying. It's using conceptual wisdom, which is prajna, to get to non-conceptual wisdom. Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom. Perfect wisdom in this philosophy is a non-conceptual, direct, unmediated, immediate visceral experience of reality without conceptual overlay. What we're constantly doing is we're narrating our experience. We're applying words, concepts, ideas to the things that we're experiencing. We're naming and labeling our feelings. We're constantly saying, how does this make me feel? Is this attractive? Is this repulsive? Is this something I want more of? Is this something I want less of? We're constantly fabricating our world, fabricating our experience. And really what we're doing is fabricating our experience, but the fundamental flaw is that we think that our experience is objectively true about the world, the outer world. We're constantly ascribing motivations to other people. When we don't understand where people are coming from, we think that there must be something wrong with them. But that's all taking place in our own framework. That's our own worldview, our own ideologies, that much of the time we're not aware that that's what we're doing because it's happening so quickly. So non-conceptual wisdom is engaging with the world without constantly being filtered through our ideology, our worldview, our ideas, our opinions, our feelings, our thoughts. And what makes that non-conceptual is that experiencing the world directly, we can't say anything about it without introducing new ideas, new concepts, in order to talk about it, we're packaging it up from our perspective. This is what's called duality versus non-duality in Buddhism. And duality is that I'm trapped in my subjective experience. I only have access to the world through my six senses, my five senses and my mind, my consciousness, the sixth sense in Buddhism, which we'll talk about today. And so that's the world for me. And I don't have access to anyone else's version of the world, but everyone else's version of the world is similarly limited by their experience, by their senses. And so Buddhism is saying it's possible to experience the world without it being filtered through your conceptual overlay, without it being filtered through your worldview. And that's the purpose of studying wisdom. That's the purpose of Prajnaparamita. So this is this kind of difficult, loaded. It's actually not that difficult, but it's difficult to access. But once you access it, it's not that difficult. This concept of emptiness in Buddhism. And part of what makes it difficult is that emptiness is very easily misconstrued as nihilism. And it's a common sort of misconception in Buddhism that emptiness means that there's nothing. But what emptiness means, and what the Heart Sutra is all about, is that the world or objects are empty of the qualities that we ascribe to them as self-existent. This is what we talked about a lot in the class last week. And so early in the Heart Sutra, it defines this. This is the famous statement from Heart Sutra. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Form is not other than emptiness. Emptiness is not other than form. Whatever is form, that is emptiness. Whatever is emptiness, that is form. And that's true not just of form, but it's also true of sensation, perception, volition, and consciousness itself. So this is a challenging concept to grasp. But it's not as challenging as it sounds. It's just challenging to grasp. Once you have it, it seems kind of self-evident, actually. The Heart Sutra in the line before that one says that things are empty of self-nature. We have, remember, we have this, the Buddhist sutras are in a narrative format. So we have Avalokiteshvara, the Buddha of compassion, the Bodhisattva of compassion, meditating on Prajnaparamita. He's hanging out in this non-dual, non-conceptual perfection of wisdom meditative space. He looks out upon the world, so there's not nothing. He's in Prajnaparamita, but there's not nothing. He's looking out upon the world, he or she. Avalokiteshvara's gender is ambiguous, which is true actually of all Buddhas, but Avalokiteshvara is looking out upon the world, and what Avalokiteshvara sees is that the things that make up a person, the characteristics of a person, are all empty of self-nature. And that's svabhava shunya in the text. So svabhava, bhava meaning being, things, nature or essence or selfness. These are all weird technical terms. They're all weird words, right? But a thing's beingness, a thing's existence, it's the text calls it self-existence. So that's interesting because we have the word existence and we have the word self, and they're combined to create a new word, self-existence. So it's not just that it exists, it's that it seems to exist intrinsically. So its seeming intrinsic existence is empty, meaning it lacks the self-existence that it seems to have. And that seems is what's crucial, because the self-nature of a thing is not coming from the thing. It's coming from our conception of it. So when I have a teacup, the teacup seems to me to be a teacup. It's not a pen. It's not a shoe. It's not my car keys. It's not all of the other things. And I don't struggle with that, right? I don't have to look at this object and be like, is this my car keys? No, this is a teacup. Its teacupness is its self-nature. It seems to me unambiguously, obviously, clearly a teacup. When I leave the room, my teacup is still here because it's my teacup. That's its self-nature. And it's empty of that. It doesn't have those characteristics. And the reason is because those characteristics only exist as a quality of my perception. They don't exist as a quality of the object. And that's what we really have to grasp in the concept of emptiness. So what empty of self-nature means, things that we think of as self-nature that are not actually there, are qualities like permanence. So I think of the teacup as permanent, and like, okay, when I think about it, I know like I could drop the teacup and break it, or my house could burn down and the teacup could be lost in a fire, or somebody could come into my house and take my teacup, and when I would come back, my teacup would be completely missing. So I know, or the sun could go supernova and destroy the entire planet and my teacup would cease to exist. So when I think about it, okay, I know that it's not permanent in that sense, but the permanence that I think it has is that when I leave the room and when I come back, it's going to be there. It seems permanent to me. Emptiness, Buddhism is saying that is a quality of my perception, not a quality of the object. Another example of self-nature is that I think that my stuff is under my control. So similarly, I think that my teacup, if my teacup had self-nature, it couldn't break. I couldn't lose it because it would be under my control. That's another example of the self-nature that it doesn't have, because of course, upon analysis, of course the teacup could be lost or destroyed. Of course it's empty of self-nature. But moment to moment, I assume when I go to sleep that my teacup is going to be there in the moment. That idea that the teacup is always going to be there, when unexamined, that idea that the teacup is always going to be there, that's the self-nature that emptiness is negating, that Buddhist emptiness is negating. Another example of the self-nature is that when something seems to me to be what it is unequivocally, like somebody says something rude to me, and my immediate reaction is the rudeness of that person. The rude person is its svabhava, right? The fact that I think that is a rude person is the self-nature of the rude person. But I can disprove that that's true. I can disprove that the self-nature of the rude person isn't true. I can prove that it's not true, which is that they're not always rude. They're not rude to all people at all times. As I develop more patience, I can not react to the rudeness. I can just let it go. Somebody says something rude to me, and I can learn how to not let it bother me. And that's the self-nature of the rude person is changeable. I can change the rude person into not a rude person by changing how I react to them. So this is an example. The self-nature, the svabhava, is the rude person. But the rude person is empty of the self-nature of the rude person. And the proof of that is that I can change my attitude, or that they're not rude all the time. If they had the svabhava of the rude person, everybody would find them rude all the time. There would not be any possibility for them to not be a rude person. That's the svabhava that Buddhism is negating with emptiness. So you can see how once you start to work with this, it's not that far out. Like emptiness, like we can get into metaphysical emptiness and non-duality, but beginning to get a toehold into emptiness is not that difficult. It's pretty easy for us to see, like, oh, if I was more patient and I didn't get irritated, that was a Freudian slip. If I develop more patience and I'm less irritated, then I change the seeming self-nature of the irritating person. Okay. I don't mean to belabor the point, but emptiness is something that, the whole text is about emptiness. So we have to at least start playing with the idea as we get into it. So we have this formula that Avalokiteshvara has set up for us. Avalokiteshvara looks upon the world and he sees what are called the 5 skandhas. Skandha is a weird word in English. It's a Sanskrit word. And when he says the 5 skandhas, and he starts with form, right? Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Whatever, form is not other than emptiness. Emptiness is not other than form. Whatever is form, that is emptiness. Whatever is emptiness, that is form. That's the formula we need to recite in our mind. And he says this is just true of form, but it's true of the other 4 skandhas as well. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and start talking about these technical terms in Buddhism, because we need to kind of understand what Avalokiteshvara is talking about in order to understand what he's negating. One of the things that makes the Heart Sutra a controversial text, even within Buddhism, is that it attacks other Buddhist ideas. It philosophically attacks other Buddhist ideas. So in early Buddhism, Buddha simply defines, he actually doesn't use the word shunyata. He doesn't use the word emptiness, but he does say that things are impermanent and that that suffering comes from thinking things are not impermanent. Because we think that the relationship is going to last forever, because we have this idea of the self-nature of the relationship as lasting forever, when the relationship ends, we feel very devastated because we thought the relationship was permanent in some kind of subtle way. And so Buddha is saying, like, it's good to have the relationship, it's fine to have the relationships, but don't be attached to it, because if you're attached to its permanence, you're going to be dismayed when its nature as not permanent reveals itself. And that's pretty much the extent of Buddhist emptiness in early Buddhism, in the original sutras, before Mahayana came on the scene, before Prajnaparamita came on the scene, which are philosophical developments that came to Buddhism later. One of the early things that Buddha says is, like, you think that you have a self, but actually you're just this combination of the 5 skandhas. And the idea of yourself, your svabhava, your self-existent self, the you who you believe yourself to be, the I that I am so subjectively tangled up in that I cannot see the world from any perspective other than my own perspective, because I'm me and everything else is not me. That self is an emergent phenomenon of these functions. And these functions are the skandhas. So the word skandha in Sanskrit is weird to translate into English. It has meanings like quantity, grouping, material collected into a bulk. So a skandha is like a pile of garbage or something. I think of it as like categories. Like we have categorical thinking, right? We're like, we have categories that, like, tea is one category and coffee is another category, but then we can create a new category that includes both tea and coffee, and it's like brewed beverage, right? Hot brewed beverage. So we create these different categories, and we would say, well, like iced tea and iced coffee is different than hot tea and hot coffee. And so these are skandhas that we're creating, right? We're creating these groupings that we then apply categories to, and that's how we're constantly seeing, is it this or is it that? Like we have categories of cats and we have categories of dogs, and that's like the skandha of cats and the skandha of dogs. But then we can also take the skandha of pets and put both cats and dogs and then a lot of other creatures that are not cats and dogs into that skandha. And so in Buddhism, or in English, you'll often hear this word translated as aggregates or heaps, which are both adequate translations for the word skandha if you're just looking it up in the dictionary, but I don't really think it captures, like, we don't think of form as a heap. We don't think of physicality as a heap, but we can think of it as a category, right? A category of how we collect objects and classify them. And so form is the first of the 5 skandhas. And form means, first of all, our body, because that's our subjective form skandha. Like, that's how we experience the form skandha first and foremost, is like, I can feel my body, and I don't feel the book until I touch it, and then the book becomes part. The book becomes part of my form skandha because now I'm touching it, and I'm having like tactile sensations of the book, and so the book, like the form skandha of my body and the form skandha of the book are I'm having a tactile sensation of that. But actually, according to Buddhism, according to this model, all physical objects are part of my form skandha. Everything that I see is part of my form skandha. So from that point of view, because we're talking about a self, we're talking about myself or yourself. I mean, we're not just talking about myself, but for me, it's myself, right? For you, it's yourself. I don't know anything about yourself, but I know a lot about myself, and I am very interested in what happens to myself. But the rest of yourselves, I'm kind of ambivalent about because it's not myself. That's how I know I know that I'm real, and the rest of you are just kind of ideas out there floating around. And not just because of Zoom, even if we were in the room together. Our form skandhas would be have a little more interrelationship if we were in the same room together. But nevertheless, one of the characteristics of the skandha is that thinking that my body is separate from my environment is an illusion. That's part of the aggregate. That's part of the heap. They're a single heap. And what's important about this is that we're actually talking about consciousness, and physical objects are a quality of consciousness, because my experience of the world is taking place through my process of interacting with things. And I can hypothetically go into my refrigerator right now and know what is more or less is in my refrigerator, and I can kind of extend my mind to include that in my form skandha right now. But it's part of my form skandha, and I can think about things in other parts of the world. I can think about people in other parts of the world, and they're part of my form skandha in as much as I can expand what I'm conscious of, what I'm aware of. I can direct my awareness, I can direct my consciousness to be aware of these physical objects. And all of that together is the form skandha. And it's sort of like wherever we go, the world is sort of folding out in front of us. When I open the door, the hallway sort of materializes in front of me. And I don't know if you've ever... I experience this when I'm driving. And sometimes when I'm driving, I don't feel like I'm moving through space. I feel like I'm situated in the middle and everything else is kind of moving around me. And the world is sort of peeling out in front of me and sealing up behind me. And I think of that as as a sort of way of feeling the form skandha, because it's not just me and my car hurtling through the cosmos. It's that the world that I experience is the world of form for me. And similarly, the world of experience, the world of form that you experience is the world of form for you. So this is the form aggregate, the form heap. Ooh, I just really don't like the word heap for skandha. It just doesn't capture the vibe, But it's an accurate translation, and translation is a huge problem in all philosophical stuff where you're not working in the language that it was written in. So I'm not going to get started on that. But it is a good example of emptiness, though. The emptiness of words. You'll see the word heap instead of skandha, but skandha means heap, but it doesn't really capture the idea of what skandha is saying in this context of the 5 skandhas. So Avalokiteshvara says Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. He doesn't say form has emptiness and emptiness has form. Form is emptiness and emptiness is form. Form is not other than emptiness, and emptiness is not other than form. How do we wrap our minds around that? Whatever is form, that is emptiness. Whatever is emptiness, that is form. And the same is true. Here's the next line in the text. Evam eva vedana samjñā samskara vijñānam. These are the other four aggregates. Vedana, samjñā, samskara, vijñāna. Vedana, I've kind of exhausted form a little bit, but Vedana is the next of the five aggregates. And this is sensation. And it's basic sensory experience. We think of sensation, one of the things that we do automatically, that Buddhism is trying to break down the process into micro moments to help us see how what we think of as self, what we think of as svabhava, self-nature, is actually coming into being through a gajillion micro moments of compiling our world. And we just sort of gloss over that compiling process and we say, oh, teacup. But actually there's many different discrete functions, discrete activities that are happening in our consciousness that lead up to me identifying this as a teacup. And the first one is sensation. And sensation, it means basic sensory experience. It means basic contact with any raw sense data. So we'll get into the senses in a little bit. If we have time today, we'll get into the senses, but if not, we'll get into them next week. The senses in Buddhism are the five senses that we're used to, right? Sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. But it also includes consciousness, our thinking capacity. And so there are objects of sensation that each of our five senses encounter. And then the sixth sense of consciousness engages with mental objects. Like I can right now ask you to imagine an orange, and you can have some kind of, you can perceive an orange with your mental consciousness, even though you're not perceiving it with your eyes and your nose and your mouth. But if I tell you that feeling of putting a piece of an orange slice in your mouth and biting down on it, you can invoke that in your mind even though it's not happening. And so that's the sixth sense that you're experiencing without the other five senses contacting an object. So sensation, Vedana, is that basic contact. And in Buddhism, in Buddhist sort of psychology, Buddhist, I don't know, they don't really have neurology, but that's how we get in the modern world. This is how we would think of this as kind of neuroscience. But Buddhism has a different sort of way of categorizing it. But that's what we're talking about, is the basic contact with a sense object. And so that sensation is the capacity to contact a sense object. And then the immediate visceral response of positive, negative, or neutral. So this is an example of sensation is when you touch something hot and you immediately pull your hand away before you don't put your hand on it and say, is this pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral? Sensation is that immediate response, Or when you put something disgusting into your mouth and you immediately spit it out because it's oh, that's rotten, that's moldy. Sometimes we don't see the mold, we don't smell the mold, but as soon as we put it in our mouth, we know it's moldy. That's the sensation. And then later there's these conceptual overlays of saying, oh, that unpleasant sensation was rotten food. But Buddhism breaks this down to say that that sensation, the capacity to contact a sense object with your sense organ, is one of the five skandhas, one of the five heaps, one of the categories of experience. That's one of the ways that I'm going to try to translate skandha. A lot of times people just don't translate these Sanskrit words because we don't have clear English translations for them. Samsara is a great example of that. So this category of experience, That's how I'm defining skandha right now. This category of experience is the capacity to make contact between a sense organ and a sense consciousness, and then the immediate visceral response to it. The next of the 5 is perception. Sanskrit is samjñā. So we're translating this text, the Heart Sutra, directly from Sanskrit because I think we gain a lot of insight about what the text is saying by looking at it in the original language. Samjñā is the prefix sam, which means to join, and jñā, which is the same word as in prajñā, right? Wisdom. So jñā is to know. It's the root that means to know. So samjñā means to put together, to experience connecting, to experience joining. We could say putting together or together maker. That would be kind of a clunky but literal translation of samjñā. We could say constructing. But again, constructing doesn't really describe this, because this is the next, these are progressive. The 5 skandhas, again, the word heaps doesn't really catch this because it makes them sound like they're discrete piles of something that you have, like there's 5 piles of something in the middle of the room. But they're also progressive stages of how consciousness moves from form to awareness. And so the first of these is Vedana, some sensation, basic sensation. Samjñā means perception. So if we're putting together, what we're putting together is the sense object and the perception of the sense consciousness connecting with the sense object. So there's the immediate visceral sensation. This is Vedana. Vedana is like, okay, I can label these characteristics. It's smooth, it's cool. When I look at it, I can see that it's kind of transparent and cloudy. Like those are perceptions. The sensations are precognitive, before I've labeled anything. Basic sense contact. Samjñā, perception, is the awareness of the characteristics. So samjñā would be like the smoothness, the coolness, my ability to label, put names on these things, to identify the characteristics. It's still not yet teacup. It's still just identifying and labeling the base characteristics of the sensations. So the sensation, first there's the form, rupa, the existence of the world. Then there's the contact of the sense object to the sense organ. That's Vedana. And then we have samjñā, which is that I'm aware of the contact in the sense consciousness. And then we have the 4th one, which is samskara. Now sam is the same prefix, right? To connect with. And then kur, samskara, the kur is the verb to do or to make. So whereas samjñā is to be aware of the joining, samskara is to form or make, to form an idea about it, a basic idea about it. So again, I want to emphasize that these are all kind of subconscious functions of awareness, of consciousness. Samskara is another word that's very difficult to translate, because in some ways we have samjñā, which is to be aware of the joining, and then samskara, which is to make or do the joining. And this word is translated often as impulses or volition. It can mean karmic activities. These are the literal translations. Now, how samskara is used in Buddhist sort of psychology is that we have like a basic reactivity, our basic impulse to label things as the object. So samskara is the point at which this becomes a teacup. But what's crucial to understand is that that's not something I'm deciding. It's driven by a quality of my perception, right? I don't, like I said before, I don't look at this and think, is it a pen? Is it car keys? Is it a shoe? Is it a cat? What category does this fit into? Oh yeah, this is a teacup. Samskara is when I look at this and without any hesitation, I know that it's a teacup. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to choose, which I'm not able to choose which label to apply to this thing. I immediately viscerally experience it as a teacup, and the teacup-ness seems to be a quality of the teacup. That's its svabhava, its self-nature, which we're saying is empty. So volition is, again, here we go with the translation stuff. Volition is a way that that way that samskara can be translated into English is volition. But the problem with the English word volition is it sounds willful. Volition in English sounds like, I am making this a teacup. I decide that it's a teacup. That's where its teacupness is coming from. That's what the word volition sounds like it means in English. But in Buddhism, if we're going to use volition as a technical term in Buddhism, volition is a precognitive impulse to see the world the way that we do. In other words, the categories that we're applying are not categories that we're choosing to apply to things. They're driven, they're forced upon us. And this is where, like karma, or more specifically the 12 links of interdependence, which this text gets into and which we will talk about. The 12 links of interdependence, volition is a precognitive level. It's even before name and form, which in the 12 links, name and form is the moment at which you go, oh, this is a teacup. Okay. Before that even is the impulse to label things. And the impulse to label things, to categorize things, is a precognitive function of consciousness. So this is samskara. These impulses, driven by causes, but driven by the vast matrix of causation, which is too complex to understand because there's just way too many moving parts for us to wrap our mind around. We're driven to see things the way that we do. It seems to us automatic. That seeming as automatic is the svabhava. The fact that this is a teacup, the instant I lay eyes on it, that's its svabhava. But that instant of laying eyes on it is premeditated because of the form skandha, the Vedana sensation skandha, the samjñā perception skandha, and then samskara, the impulse to label. And then the fifth of these is vijñāna, and that's consciousness. Consciousness is the moment at which the vijñāna is the moment at which I am aware that I experience the thing as the thing. So normally, when we think about consciousness, we think of basically what Buddhism is trying to refute is that we think of there's the world and there's my consciousness that's apprehending the world. But Buddhism is saying, well, no, that's actually like the world exists whether the world exists as a quality of your perception, because the world only exists as a joining of your perception and the sense object. You have your perceptual qualities, and you have the sense objects, and then when those things match, when those things meet, that's when the physical world comes into being. And that meeting takes place because of all of these discrete functions which are happening almost simultaneously, almost instantaneously, definitely precognitively, pre-aware, beneath our conscious awareness, where we have the capacity for sensation, the capacity for perception, the drive to label and categorize things, samskara. And then we have consciousness, the capacity to discern things. So consciousness is vijnana. Now this is interesting because we have samjñā, which is the same jñā as vijnana. Samjñā means to join the knowing, which it doesn't mean cognitive knowing, it's just an experiential knowing, to join the knowing with the object. That's the word for sensation. The word for basic sense contact is samjñā, the joining together of the knowing and the sense. Vijnana, vi means to separate, to divide. So vijñā is when I'm distinguishing different things. That's when I'm saying, oh, that's a cat, that's a dog. I'm able to perceive the difference between those. All of these other experiential steps have happened prior to that moment where I go, okay, that's a cat. Okay, that's a teacup. Okay, that's my car keys. Like, that's happening at the level of vijnana, because vijnana is the ability to distinguish between things. This is I have the blue book versus the yellow book or something like that, right? That's happening at the level of vijnana. But even then, like book is happening at the level of vijnana. But samskara is the capacity to categorize things prior to vijnana of apprehending the distinction, the distinction that's being made. So according to Buddhist psychology or Buddhist science of the mind, which is it's contentious to try to combine these Buddhist philosophical concepts with these Western philosophical or scientific concepts. So, we have to play a little bit with words in order to wrap our mind around it. But according to this sort of Buddhist psychology, our consciousness, our self, the svabhava of myself, and the svabhava of all of the objects in the world, the seeming self-nature of the world, are actually an emergent phenomenon, a byproduct of, the end result of all of these different functions, all of these different skandhas operating in concert, all of these different capacities, these different types of capacity for perception, these different types of experiencing are all happening as the condition of possibility, as the basis, as the foundation, as the framework for what I call self, what I call me, what I call teacup, what I call car keys, a cat, whatever. The svabhava, the self-nature of the thing, the seeming self-existence of the thing, is an emergent phenomenon of all of these functions of perception operating in concert. Now that's the old school Buddhist definition of what a self is. It's not what we think the svabhava. We think the svabhava is the self, and Buddhism is saying, no, that's not, that svabhava doesn't exist. It's actually this emergent phenomenon of all of these functions going on. That's what I just described, right? Now, the Heart Sutra comes in here with a hatchet and starts attacking all of that stuff, and it says those things don't exist either. So if you're an old school Buddhist coming from and you've been studying the suttas, the old school sutras, and you say, okay, now I understand. The self is not the svabhava, the self is the skandhas. I've got it now. I've got it all worked out. I'm not my svabhava is not my ego identity, my personality. The svabhava is not the teacupness of the teacup. I know that now. And the Heart Sutra comes in and says, no, those things aren't real either. You've applied a new self, a new svabhava, to the skandhas. And the skandhas don't have a svabhava either. And this is where the Heart Sutra starts to kind of go off the rails. That's why there's one of the commentary, a modern commentary on the Heart Sutra is called the Heart Attack Sutra. Because he says that the author says that if we really understood what the Heart Sutra was saying, it would give us a heart attack. Or maybe another way of looking at it is that when the Heart Sutra came on the scene, the Buddhist scene, all of the classical Buddhists had a heart attack because the Heart Sutra comes in and you've got your skandhas now. And the Heart Sutra comes in and says, no, you can't have those either. We're going to take your skandhas away from you. And so the Heart Sutra is now telling us that even the functions don't have a self-nature. So we start to deconstruct. We've deconstructed the gross mind by saying, well, the gross mind is an emergent phenomena of the skandhas. And now we're going after the skandhas and we're saying, but the subtle functions of the subtle mind, that those don't have a self-nature either. Those are also things that you are putting. The fact that you think that that's a thing is itself a svabhava that's also not there. These things also have the characteristics of emptiness. They're also impermanent. They're on a subtle impermanent. And I was talking about gross impermanence in the, like, I could drop the cup and break it. That's the gross impermanence of the cup. But emptiness saying, well, there's a subtle impermanence to the cup, that the moment-to-moment existence of the cup is a quality of my perception, not a quality of the cup. It's not that the cup is going to last for a while and then go away. That's its gross impermanence. But it's also subtly impermanent, which that it's moment-to-moment, instant-to-instant, is coming into its reality is not as a cup. Its reality is as a moment-to-moment perception of a cup. And that perception of a cup is underlied by the five skandhas. But now we're going after the five skandhas and saying, well, those too don't have a self-nature. Those too also don't have a svabhava. So this is what the Heart Sutra is going to peck away at classical, I don't know how to call it, classical Buddhist philosophy. I was struggling with this earlier. It's like Buddhism itself is lots of aggregates, lots of skandhas of things that we put together, and we apply the skandha Buddhism to like this vast array of different philosophical ideas. And one example of that is that old school Buddhism is saying, oh, the skandhas, you don't have a self, you have the skandhas. And then Mahayana, or Prajnaparamita more specifically, Prajnaparamita comes along and says, no, you don't have those either. Those also are empty of self-nature. And it starts deconstructing the Buddhist philosophy that previously was like sacrosanct, that previously was the teachings of the Buddha. And then Prajnaparamita comes in and starts deconstructing what was previously held as sort of the orthodoxy of Buddhist teachings. This next line goes into more of a definition of emptiness. It has a bunch of negations and it gives it kind of a nice lyrical quality. Here it is in Sanskrit. Eha Shariputra sarva dharmaha shunyata lakshanaha anutpanna aniruddha amala avimala anuna aparipurnaha. It's got a nice flow to it, I think. He's saying, okay, therefore Shariputra is the interlocutor, and the beginning of the text, Shariputra is the one who is hanging out in the audience. Buddha is up on the throne, Avalokiteshvara is up on the throne, and Shariputra says, hey, I've got a question. How do we practice Prajnaparamita? Because he can see that, his teachers are up there in deep meditation, and he says, how do we do this? How do we live in order to put this into practice? Again, this is sort of a characteristic way of all of the sutras. Almost all of the sutras begin with somebody in the audience asking a question. It's usually Shariputra. So that's why this line has Shariputra in it. He's addressing Shariputra. Therefore, Shariputra, sarva dharma, all dharmas, shunyata lakshanaha, have the mark of emptiness. So this is interesting. The first word is there's compounds. In Sanskrit, there's a lot of compounds where two words get mashed together to create a concept. And so in this case, it's sarva dharma. Sarva means all. And dharma this is an interesting place. This is an interesting use of the word dharma, not uncommon in Buddhism. And like a lot of Sanskrit words, they take on there's many different possible definitions of a Sanskrit word. And the same word can mean different things in different contexts, in different places. And so we use the word dharma as kind of a shorthand for what we really mean is Buddha Dharma. Because the word dharma can mean lots of different things. It can mean teachings. So there's one form of dharma that means teachings. Like when we take refuge in the Dharma, we can take refuge in the Buddhist teachings, Buddhist philosophical principles. We can take refuge in Buddhist texts. The toolbox, as I put it, right? That's sort of Dharma in the sense of teachings. But Dharma can also mean truth or law. It can mean it can mean law in the sense of a natural law, like the law of gravity. And it can also mean law in the sense of like a political or litigious law, like if there's a law against jaywalking. So dharma can take either one of those meanings as well. It can mean reality. So sometimes we use the word dharma to talk about emptiness, right? Like the dharma body of the Buddha, the dharmakaya, if you've ever heard that term. The dharmakaya is the truth body of a Buddha. And so in that case, dharma means truth, and truth is referring to emptiness. So that's kind of a colloquialism within Buddhism to use dharma as truth, and truth meaning non-duality, non-conceptual understanding of ultimate reality. So there's quite a bit of layers just in the word dharmakaya. Kaya means body, form. Form or body. So dharmakaya is the truth body of a Buddha, and truth meaning the non-conceptual reality, non-conceptual unmediated perception of reality. So dharma can take on that connotation, but it can also mean phenomena or experiences, in the sense of we experience the world, things seem real to us because we're experiencing them. So the word dharma can mean something very different in Buddhism, where it can mean truth, it can mean teachings, but it can also mean moments of consciousness. So there's a philosophical system within Buddhism called Abhidharma. And I don't know if you've ever heard this term Abhidharma. Tibetan Buddhism doesn't go into a whole lot of detail talking about Abhidharma, but they do mention it as a philosophical system. So if you hang around in Tibetan Buddhist circles, they'll talk about Abhidharma without going into a great deal of detail about what Abhidharma means. But Abhidharma, Abhi means higher or greater, and Dharma in this case means knowledge or wisdom or truth. So Abhidharma is sometimes translated as higher wisdom or higher truth. But within Abhidharma, I'm trying to help explain why this word dharma is complex and means different things in different contexts. So within Abhidharma, the word dharma it refers to a momentary, discrete instantiation of consciousness. And so according to Abhidharma, our mind is not moving in a flow, but our mind is like frames of a movie, where it's like micro moments, of which they say there are 60 every finger snap. So in this amount of time, you have 60 dharmas, 60 instantiations of consciousness every finger snap. Some people say that it's much more than that. There are Abhidharma texts I've seen that say that there are 50,000 dharmas every finger snap. So in other words, it's like there are micro moments of consciousness, and that these are like cascading in a row, and each one kind of triggers the next one, and that one triggers the next one, and that one triggers the next one. And they're happening in these like discrete moments that are moving at like 60, at 1 million frames a second or 1 billion frames per second or something like that. And they refer to those moments of consciousness as dharmas. So each micro moment of consciousness is a dharma. And those dharmas are, it's not like a stream, but it's like falling dominoes, where each one is the trigger for the subsequent one, and that's the trigger for the subsequent one, and then that goes on infinitely forward in time, and with not ever having had a beginning moment in time. So we're like these frames of a movie. So that's part of, like, in the Abhidharma system, that's one of the ways that they define consciousness, is that we're like this cascading flow of experiences that trigger subsequent experiences. So in this line, he's referencing Abhidharma by saying Sarvadharma Shunyata Lakshanaha. Sarvadharma, all dharmas, all of these micro moments of instantiations of consciousness, which in theory are discrete, but in our experience we don't break them down into those micro moments. Part of the Abhidharmic experiment was extremely deep meditators who can like slow down time so much that they can see everything that's happening in each instant of consciousness, because then there's several things happening in each instant of consciousness that's triggering the subsequent instant of consciousness. And they're trying to break down, in the Abhidharma system, they're trying to break down how karma is working, how karmic seeds trigger subsequent events, and how karma is moving in what appears to be a flow but is actually micro moments. So here he's referencing Abhidharma by saying all dharmas have the mark of emptiness, shunyata, emptiness. And remember, shunya means empty or void or absence. And then ta, the suffix ta, makes it a process. And so that's shunyata, the emptiness of something. So emptiness isn't a thing, but it's a process. It's the lack of something that we are imposing. So when we say things are empty, sarvadharma, all dharmas are empty, or have emptiness, or are emptiness. What it's saying is that we're imposing the meaning content onto things, and that they're empty of the content that we're imposing. Now the word lakshana, which is another compound, shunyata lakshana, which means the lakshana of emptiness. But lakshana is another really tricky word in Sanskrit. And it's one that is it's even worse than some of the other words that I've mentioned in terms of like being able to pin down what it's saying, because it's so contextual. It takes on different meanings in all kinds of different situations. And I've read texts which are translated into English where I'm just reading the English translation, but the author translates the word lakshana as different words throughout the book. So, some translators take as a goal, if they're going to translate it from Sanskrit into English, they find one English word that can stand for that Sanskrit word in all circumstances throughout the book. But I've seen other translators who translate the Sanskrit word differently depending on the context, which is quite confusing. Especially if you're not able to go back to the original Sanskrit or the original Chinese, as the case may be, or Tibetan, and compare. So the word lakshana can mean mark, as in you have a bunch of bags of coffee and you're marking if they're A grade or B grade, and so that mark would be the lakshana. It can mean sign, like the road sign, right? So if you see a road sign, and like I drive up and down 101 and it constantly is changing speeds, and so sometimes it has the lakshana of being 55 miles an hour, and sometimes it has the lakshana of being 65 miles an hour, and sometimes it has the lakshana of 35 miles an hour, and the lakshana is the sign that tells me, the street sign that tells me how fast I'm supposed to be going. So that street sign would be a lakshana. The number on the street sign would be the mark, the lakshana. It can also mean symbol. So like we could say that like a written number is a symbol for a quantity. The written symbol isn't the quantity. If you have 2 apples, the number 2 doesn't mean you have 2 discrete things. It's a symbol representing 2 discrete things, right? So the number 2 would be a symbol. So that would be another possible definition of lakshana. It can mean attribute. So it can mean like a quality or characteristic. So a lakshana can be like a lakshana of my freshly brewed tea is that it's hot. A characteristic of the tea is that it's hot. So that is another possibility of lakshana, that you can define qualities or characteristics of something. It means to mark, to sign, to characterize, indicate, or designate. So lakshana could also be pointing. I'm pointing at my teacup, and the pointing is the lakshana. I'm indicating this teacup. So that's another possible way of thinking about lakshana. It can mean aim at or direct toward. So if I have a bow and arrow and I'm trying to hit the target, my act of honing in on the target with my bow and arrow would be the lakshana. I'm aiming towards something. So the lakshana of emptiness is a pretty tricky term because there's so many different possible ways to think about this. One of the ways that this is indicated, not in this text, but you perhaps, especially if you're in the Tibetan Buddhist world, have heard this Sanskrit word Mahamudra. The word mudra, which can mean like a hand gesture, right? Like if people do these like hand gestures to indicate things, they're sort of like ritual gestures. So that's a form of a mudra, but mudra can also mean a stamp or a seal. So the seal would be like in the old days when you would fold up a letter and then you would put hot wax on it and then you would stamp it, and then that seal would show who the letter is from. And as long as that seal is intact, you know that the letter hasn't been opened. And the stamp tells you whose letter it is because the stamp is like their signature. So you know it's an official document from somebody and it hasn't been doctored because it's still sealed shut. That would be like the mudra. And so Mahamudra means the great seal, and that's a euphemism for emptiness. So here we have the word lakshana, which means mark or attribute or sign. And you could and so lakshana is similar to mudra in this instance, where the mudra, the great mudra, Mahamudra, is the mark of emptiness, the shunyata lakshana. Sarvadharma shunyata lakshana. Every instantiation of consciousness has the characteristic quality of emptiness. Anutpanna, aniruddha, amala, avimala, anuna, aparipurnaha. Oh, it's just so pretty. I love that. I'm going to mention these words here, and probably we're going to start with this next week as well, review it. I don't want to go over time, so I don't want to go too much into this. So all of these words have the prefix of an or a, which means which is a negation. So all of these words mean not this thing. This is one of the characteristics of emptiness. One of the qualities of talking about emptiness is that it's described in negatives. Some schools of Buddhism do talk about emptiness in its positive characteristics, but for the most part, emptiness is described as a negation. So anutpanna means not born, and aniruddha means not destroyed. Amala means not impure. Avimala means not pure. Anuna means not deficient. And aparipurnaha means completely full. but it's negated. So it means not deficient and not full, not completed. I guess a paripurnaha would, purna means full and pari means completely. So it's saying completely full, as in like completely satisfied, cannot be improved upon, absolutely perfect, but it's negated. So it's saying it's not complete. It's not deficient. Emptiness is not deficient, but it's not complete. It's not produced. It's not destroyed. It's not impure, and it's not pure. So all dharmas have the mark of emptiness. All phenomena, all experiences, everything that could possibly happen, certainly all of our experiences, they're not born and they're not destroyed. So here, even though he's saying things are absent of the self-nature that they seem to have, they're also not born and not destroyed. Things don't have an origin and they don't have an end or a cessation. They're not impure, meaning, impure in this case does literally mean, the word impure means dirt or stain or feces. Like it has the same connotation that impure does in English. They're not impure, but they're also not pure. They're not with a stain or impurity, but they're also not without a stain or perfect. Nothing is wanting, nothing is deficient, nothing is incomplete, but also nothing is ever accomplished. Nothing is ever perfect. Nothing is ever full. So I think that's a good place to end. That's a kind of a meditative topic. And we'll start, I think next week we'll start with this line again. Because it's worth reviewing. It's one of the important lines in the text that's defining emptiness. And then the text goes on to the next thing that it discusses are the sense organs, the sense objects, and the sense consciousnesses. So it's going into the process of perception into an even finer detail, because we did the five skandhas, the five categories of perception. But then it goes into another layer of perception, which is how the sense organs are working. And it deconstructs how the sense organs are working, and then, of course, as the Heart Sutra does, it summarily negates them. And then after that, we go into the 12 links of dependent origination, which is how things are coming into being, according to this sort of classical old school Buddhism. So that's what we'll get into after the sense consciousnesses. And of course, Buddhism does get into this text, the Heart Sutra, does get into how to practice prajnaparamita. So at the end of all of this negation, there is a cash out, a practice instruction. After it gives us all of this philosophical negation, deconstructing everything that Buddhism has already had to say, it then goes on to say, here's what you can do to access the perfection of wisdom, prajnaparamita. So that's something to look forward to. And as is customary at the end of a Buddhist teaching, we take some time to dedicate the merit to, as with the beginning where we set our motivation, where we think about the benefits of study and practice, of thinking about philosophy and putting philosophy into practice, and the motivation of helping others and serving others and working to make the world a better place. So too at the end, we direct the efforts that we've made to that goal again. We refresh our motivation by recalling that the purpose of studying philosophy is to develop a form of deep, lasting satisfaction for ourselves, but also for the benefit of our society, of our world, for beings that we can see and also beings that we can't see. That we're working for the benefit of others. And in doing so, in doing this practice of studying and contemplating, of developing the tools to apply to cultivate virtue, to act virtuously in the world, we're making real efforts towards that goal. And in the Buddhist model of causation, our intentions have a visceral impact on the world. Our intentions influence how the karma is going to ripen. We're planting seeds in our garden, and by dedicating our merit, we can give more nutrition and more power to some of those seeds so that they will grow more rapidly, and that they will produce fruits more powerfully and sooner. And the technique for doing that is dedicating the merit, which is to say that we're empowering those seeds to ripen in a specific way. And the most powerful way to do that is to wish that the benefits would come for others, even more so than for ourselves. So when I think about how I want my karma to ripen, I realize that I'm in pretty good shape myself. And when I look out on the world, I see that others need these benefits more than I do. And I dedicate my efforts towards their benefit rather than my own. And that makes the karma more powerful. It helps it ripen sooner. It helps it ripen faster. And it helps, and instead of just helping myself selfishly, it has a benefit for everyone. And that's really the goal, to end suffering, not just for myself, but to end suffering for others, and especially people who are suffering more so than myself.